Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Canto 4, Chapter 20, text number 22. Lord Vishnu's appearance in the sacrificial arena. Translation: the Supreme Personality of Godhead stood with his lotus feet almost touching the ground, while he rested the front of his hand on the raised shoulder of Garuda, the enemy of the snakes. Maharaj Prithu, wiping the tears from his eyes, tried to look upon the Lord, but it appeared that the king was not fully satisfied by looking at him. Thus, the king offered the following prayers. Purport: the significant point in this verse is that the Lord was standing above the ground, almost touching it. The residents of the upper planetary systems, beginning from Brahmaloka, the planet where Lord Brahma lived, down to the Swargaloka, the heavenly planet of Indra, are so advanced in spiritual life that when they come to visit this or similar other lower planetary systems, they keep their weightlessness. This means that they stand without touching the ground. Lord Vishnu is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but because he lives in one of the planetary systems within this universe, he sometimes plays as if one of the demigods of this universe. When he first appeared before Prithu Maharaj, he was not touching the ground of this earth. But when he was fully satisfied with the behavior and character of Maharaj Prithu, he immediately acted as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Narayana from Vaikuntha. Out of affection for Prithu Maharaj, he touched the earth. But he rested the front of his hand on the raised shoulder of Garuda, his carrier, as if to prevent himself from falling down. And since the Lord is not accustomed to stand on earthly ground. These are all symptoms of his great affection for Prithu Maharaj. Perceiving his fortunate position, Prithu Maharaj could not fully look upon the Lord due to ecstasy, but still, in a faltering voice, he began to offer prayers. Not touching the ground, touching the ground. Steadying himself in case he became dizzy or something. Steadying himself by placing his hand on Garuda. I don't recall other places where, let's say, where Lord Vishnu appeared before Dhruva, that he wasn't touching the ground. There's no mention. And any other place, the only place I can very clearly recall, there may be others, is Yudhisthira didn't touch the ground until he hesitated to do what Krishna said. And it's attributed to his being perfectly truthful, that he had that weightlessness or levity or mystic power that he wouldn't touch the ground, and his chariot didn't touch the ground. But his chariot touched the ground when he hesitated. You know, the common understanding is because he lied, his chariot had to touch the ground. But Bhaktivedanta Saraswati Thakur explained it's because he hesitated to do what Krishna wanted, and therefore his chariot touched the ground. Now, how can you move in a chariot if your chariot doesn't touch the ground? I mean, what to speak of the illogic for a logician, the illogic of chariot wheels not touching the ground. Mythology. It's metaphorical, it means something, and then they make some interpretation if they want. But how can a chariot move if it doesn't touch the ground? So how can a chariot move if it does touch the ground? You can attribute it to material law, or you can attribute it to Krishna's sanctioning, according to the laws of nature, the chariot can move when it touches the ground. So if the chariot doesn't touch the ground, what's the material law that allows the chariot to move forward? Well, it's not based on material law that it's not touching the ground to begin with. So how does it move forward? The sanction of the Supreme Lord. How do material laws work? By the sanction of the Supreme Lord. Supposing you're not a theist. They're just laws of nature. That there's no Supreme Lord. Sanctioning. Just therefore, things that are beyond, for the empiricist meaning those that are evaluating things through their blunt senses, and that's all there is. And if it can't be answered by material law, then it's hallucination, or there's some mistake, or something. Whitewash it. But there are things that are not bound by material law. And the material law has a lawmaker, a law enforcement. A lawmaker and a law enforcement. And as Prabhupada would say, that they do not know. So therefore, how to know that which you don't know if it's beyond your senses to perceive? Same as our discussion yesterday. By knowledge coming from that which is beyond material laws, or knowledge coming from transcendence, or Vedas, or Apaurushaya Shabda Praman. Then one can know about Apaurushaya, or Adhoksaja, and one could serve Adhoksaja based upon Apaurushaya Shabda. And evidence that's beyond material conception or material experience. That's like the young girl's question yesterday evening about how to, what was the word she used? How to perceive or how to experience the soul. Experience? Feel the soul. Well, because the soul is beyond the senses, you can't feel it or experience it through the senses. You can intuitively reason that it exists, or you can know that it exists by scripture, and you can detect its presence by symptoms. Same topic. Has anyone seen a mind? We know we have a mind. It sometimes makes us happy and sometimes makes us sad. We have a mind in which there are emotions. Happy and sad are just two, and there's so many others. Emotions resting within the mind. So we know that there's a mind, but we haven't seen it. We can understand its presence or feel its presence through symptoms or lakshana, characteristics. And then there's characteristics of the mind. So, and how to properly understand? Well, you can be a psychologist and kind of get some insights from using your flashlight, looking at an object, the mind, or by its symptoms, or one can know via Purusheya Shabda. So, Prithu is experiencing ecstasy, and Lord Vishnu is reciprocating with his dear devotee, his empowered king devotee. I think I mentioned this yesterday, but Prithu, as a Shakti avatar, the particular Shakti that was invested fully, the Lord's Shakti invested fully in Prithu, was his ruling potency, or Palana Shakti. So a Shakti avatar is a jiva, in most cases, a jiva acting as if the jiva is not a jiva, acting as if the jiva is the supreme. Yet, like in this case, he's clearly not the supreme. He's in the presence of the supreme. He is in ecstasy. And his ecstasy is such that as much as in ecstasy he wants to see the Lord, he can't fully see the Lord because of his ecstasy. It's impeding his material vision, or impeding his vision. So does he see or does he not see? One can say he sees. On what basis we can say he sees? Because look at his ecstasy. So what's he seeing? He's not seeing something material. He's seeing something spiritual. And he's in ecstasy seeing that something spiritual, the form of the Lord. All of this analysis or evaluation, etc., discussion, topics about the personality of Godhead, is to help us appreciate the object. We're the subject, the devotee, and the object of devotion is the Supreme. So we're, through the assistance of the Bhagavatam and the commentaries, trying to appreciate the Supreme, or trying to understand the Supreme. We can't understand the Supreme in fullness, but we can understand through the medium of sound vibration, and sound vibration from Shukadeva Goswami, and sound vibration from the acharyas that are commenting on Shukadeva Goswami's messages, to understand Krishna or Vishnu. Brahma Jigyasa, inquisitiveness in Brahma, or transcendence. Then comes the whole topic of the three features of the Absolute Truth: the Brahman feature, Paramatma feature, the Bhagavan feature. Prithu, being a devotee, is experiencing the expansion of the original Bhagavan. Krishna is the original Bhagavan. Vishnu is the expansion of his expansion. Trying to recall where the verse was, where Balaram is being addressed as the source of Vishnu. Yeah. It was in the marriage of Revati to Balaram, where Brahma is describing Balaram as the source of Vishnu. Remember? So Balaram, that means the personality of Godhead, from him expands Vishnu. We discussed this also. It's not a chronological expansion. It's the source from which Vishnu comes, ontologically, not chronologically. So Vishnu is a kala, or an expansion of the personality of Godhead. And he's coming not just as a witness, like Supersoul is the witness, as Paramatma. He's coming in person. Vishnu is coming in person before Prithu, resting his arm on Garuda, and so forth. It's the personal manifestation. It's a Bhagavan manifestation. Although normally we consider the Vishnu forms as like the Paramatma feature. But as Vishnu appeared before Prithu, and Vishnu appeared before Dhruva, this is the personal feature. Because of on the strength of his devotion, on the strength of his practice given by Narada, Dhruva was able to see the form of the Lord in the heart, in trance. And the trance broke when that form as Paramatma disappeared, and he opened his eyes, and there's Lord Vishnu with Garuda standing beside him, directly in front of little Dhruva. So here it says King Prithu seeing Lord Vishnu in the way that it's being described here. And Lord Vishnu is very pleased. And we're reading in the purport, normally when the Lord comes from the spiritual world to this world, even the demigods, they don't touch the ground when they come to this realm. But when Prithu, by his devotion, pleased Lord Vishnu, his foot touched the ground. Well, is there some implication here? Or let's say specifically with Krishna's pastimes? Krishna's feet, the footprints of Krishna's markings on his feet were shown in the soft sands of Vrindavan. That we know. Again and again that's mentioned. So reasoning says, as Vishnu being pleased with Prithu touched the ground, Krishna being pleased with the Brijvasis touched the ground. Thus sanctifying the ground. There's a nice verse in when Akrura comes to Vrindavan and sees Krishna's footprints. Before he sees Krishna, he sees Krishna's footprints. And he jumps off his chariot, he rolls in the dust of Vrindavan. On Krishna's footprints, because the footprints, the marks of Krishna's feet are not different than Krishna. The marks of Krishna's feet in the sand of Vrindavan is not different than Krishna. By Krishna's touching, of course, Vrindavan is, when Krishna descends, the whole of the spiritual world comes with him. The Adam, the transcendental abode of Krishna, is eternal. Even when Krishna departs, That part is not, even when the universe is destroyed, that part is not destroyed. That's described in Bhagavad Gita. And at the same time, when Krishna descends, his whole abode comes with him. Both. Prabhupada gives this nice example. Supposing one nation has an embassy in another country. For example, the Indian embassy there must be an Indian embassy in Washington. Is there an Indian embassy in Washington? There's one in New York, there's one in Chicago. So the India embassy, or the American embassy in Delhi. The Indian embassy in Washington is not Washington, legally. It is Little India. The water comes from India, the paper comes from India, the laws governing anybody that comes into that embassy is the laws of India. Supposing they break the law, they're not subject to U.S. law. They're subject to Indian law. Inside the building, inside the property. It's India. A little embassy of India outside of India and within another country. And I don't know about the water and the paper, but Prabhupada says like that. Even the water is from that country. And certainly the laws, if someone is arrested, they're arrested by the country whose embassy it is, under the laws of that country. So, as in the material world, there's such a thing. So, Krishna's appearance in Vrindavan, or wherever he appears, in Dwarka, wherever he appears, or here Vishnu is appearing in the palace, that place is Vaikuntha. Normally, back to this, his feet doesn't touch the ground, his feet doesn't touch the ground. However, by the reciprocation of love, of Prithu, his feet are touching the ground. He's in Vaikuntha. Now, I've heard this now in 4 different locations. I first heard it in person twice in New York. Then I heard it in a recording about Los Angeles, and then I heard about it in a recording, I think it was London. Prabhupada saying that this temple is not in New York or Los Angeles or London. It's Vaikuntha. Why? Because Krishna's here. And Krishna's service is everything that goes on in the temple. So the Vaikuntha atmosphere is created by bhakti, by putting Krishna at the center and all activities, at least ostensibly, or the design is all activities are for Krishna. So one's home can become like that. Vaikuntha. It's like the embassy model. And Krishna, where Krishna is, it's not of this material world. As bhakti is not of this material world. When bhakti is there, the spiritual world is there. So when a Akrura reaches Vrindavan, rolls in the dust, there's a verse, it's a nice verse, I just elaborate a little bit. He says, I'm the most fortunate being in creation. Now, the residents of Vrindavan are the most fortunate. Or the eternal associates of Krishna are most fortunate. But so what is the meaning behind his making that statement? So I've heard this like 3 times now. This is Hari Parshad referring to a verse written by Hari Suri, one of his favorite poet commentators on the 10th Canto Bhagavatam. Why most fortunate? Back to when Krishna descends, with Krishna comes his transcendental abode. So even the dust, we heard this during their Vrindavan Yatra, even the dust of Vrindavan, the dust of Vrindavan is one of 5 entities that can impart Krishna Prema. The dust of Vrindavan. So the dust of Vrindavan is part of Krishna's abode. And he's rolling in the dust of Vrindavan. He's getting that association of Krishna. But our teaching is the servant of the servant of the servant of the servant is the most fortunate person. So within the dust of Vrindavan grows trees. In addition to water, the seed of the tree grows from drawing nourishment from the earth. Then so that the trees of Vrindavan are recipients of Krishna's mercy from the form of the earth or the dust of Vrindavan from which they grow. Sometimes Krishna, it says in the Bhagavatam, sometimes Krishna would touch the branches or leaves to give his benediction. Sometimes he would simply glance upon the trees, appreciating the service the trees were performing, and thus the mercy of one who has received the mercy, the trees. And in the ecstasy of that good fortune of the trees, they sometimes produce flowers and fruits. And the flowers and fruits, particularly the fruits, are appreciated by the birds. So they're getting the mercy of the mercy of the mercy, eating the fruits from the trees. And they're feeling such ecstasy that they sing. And when they sing, and one hears the singing of the birds in Vrindavan, then one is getting the mercy of the mercy of the mercy of the mercy of Krishna, taking the remnants of the remnants of the remnants of Krishna. And there he is, receiving all of that. And therefore he considers himself the most fortunate, not just fortunate or more fortunate, but most fortunate. Nice. It's a poetic expression of, or rendering of, the merciful nature of Krishna's presence in Vrindavan, or Krishna's here, the Lord Vishnu's presence before Prithu. And Prithu is appreciating in a mood of ecstasy. Finally, he gathers himself together enough to offer some prayers. And that's what's coming next. Prithu's prayers. So let's see if there's some discussion.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj. I read somewhere that the spirit does not mix with matter.
Spirit is not what?
Mix with matter.
Not mixed with matter.
Material. So what is the meaning of Lord Vishnu touching the earth?
What's the meaning?
Yeah.
Your question is, what's the meaning? What's the meaning as he touched the earth?
But this is spirit. He cannot...
Oh, it's a pastime. He's entering, he's... What's the meaning of Vishnu's not touching the earth? He's neither touching nor not touching. He doesn't mix. Even when touching, he doesn't mix. Even when not touching, he doesn't mix. Because he's spirit. So to touch earth doesn't mean he's mixing. To not touch doesn't mean he's mixing. It's in another realm. just like the soul is within the body, even for the conditioned soul, the soul, it doesn't mix with matter. What mixes with matter is the misidentification of the soul with what the soul is not. The deluding feature of Maya. But even the soul that's deluded by Maya doesn't mix with matter. When there's fire, there may also be smoke, but the fire doesn't mix with the smoke. Smoke covers the fire. The sky doesn't mix with the cloud because there's another element. There may be a cloud within the sky. So that the meaning is he touched the earth. It, as we heard in the purport, as an expression of affection for Prithu. It's poetic in one sense, but it's an expression of bhakti in another sense, or reciprocation with Prithu's bhakti. We don't hear that detail, like I mentioned. We don't hear that detail about Dhruva, that otherwise Vishnu doesn't touch, but because of Dhruva, he touched. That point is not made. Here it's made, and so there's commentary on that point. But back to your question, the soul doesn't mix. Vishnu doesn't mix.
And another point that was mentioned was about the for the material laws applies to material world.
Yes.
And the spiritual law, when the spirit descends to the material realm, they are the so the demigods are starting with Brahmaloka till the Swargaloka, they do not come to they do not touch the earth, and the material laws don't apply to them. But
normally.
Yeah, and when the spirit soul, even though when the spiritual personality is on the material realm, they still undergo the material laws.
Generally.
So how that's contradiction?
Well, a transcendentalist, it's like a yogi walking on water or flying in the air, or by mystic power they can defy material law. Or for a devotee, they can exhibit power that normally one cannot exhibit. And they don't practice mystic yoga, but they may exhibit power that's not worldly for the purpose of service. How Prabhupada lived his life was otherworldly. Or how Prahlad was protected was otherworldly. Or Haridas Thakur survived the beatings in 22 marketplaces was otherworldly. Here's a Prabhupada story that I heard from Satsrup Maharaj. In the installation of Radha London Ishwara in Bury Place, before they had Soho Street Temple, in Bury Place, Prabhupada gave instructions to the devotees there how to set up an altar. It was marble altar, very heavy, there was columns, etc. As they were placing the deity inside the altar, the columns started to shake and the marble at the top started to fall. The devotees didn't move fast enough. Prabhupada moved swiftly. He held up the marble slab that took 4 men to lift, and he held it up while they adjusted the columns. And then he stepped away. And they were stunned. It took 4 men to lift it, and Prabhupada lifted it. So normally it's said a pure devotee doesn't exhibit mystic powers. But for service of Krishna, a pure devotee may exhibit mystic powers. And it wasn't a big thing in ISKCON that Prabhupada exhibited mystic powers, but those that were immediately present knew about it. Remotely, I heard about it. So a devotee can defy laws if service is wanted. Many other examples. Bhaktivinoda Thakur was protected from the mystic power of Vishnu. He was protected. Anything else?
Hare Krishna Maharaj. So here in the this Prithu Maharaj, the chapters, means Indra also means called as Bhagavan, and Krishna is also called as Bhagavan. So how should we differentiate the Bhagavan?
Two things. Normally, Prabhupada explains, the term Bhagavan is reserved for Vishnu Tattva. Normally, Bhagavan is reserved for Vishnu Tattva. Second, however, sometimes when potency of Bhagavan is invested, special potency of Bhagavan is invested, then sometimes, in circumstances, one who is so empowered may also be given the title in the scripture of Bhagavan. There's worldly people that call, somebody Bhagavan without naming, the second name that goes with Bhagavan. But from scripture, that's how to understand it. This Indra is not one that's so often, but sometimes Narada and sometimes Lord Shiva are, the adjective Bhagavan is applied to them because they're special. They're invested with potency of Bhagavan. How's that? Next.
Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj. We hear personal descriptions very clearly when Lord Vishnu, he descends and he comes and meets a form, what he wears and how he looks. Everything is beautifully described every time.
Yes.
So maybe it's a little curious question. When impersonalists describe, or how do they describe these verses? When it is very
generally, impersonalists don't comment on the Bhagavatam, following the example of Shankaracharya, who didn't comment on the Bhagavatam. There was one who did, and the commentary was lost. Following Shankaracharya, one of his followers, I forget which one, Madhusudana Saraswati, I think, but I'm not sure which one. How those who make comments on, and not besides Bhagavatam, any comment where features are described that's a covering of Maya over Brahman. That's how they interpret it or make their comments on it. And they can even glorify, like this is a wonderful feature of Maya. But beneath the Maya, beneath the covering, there's all there is Brahman. Okay?
And one more question. So I think you explained this maybe. So when Lord Vishnu touching the ground and when Krishna touching the ground, there is no difference. It's the same.
Correct. Anything else? Yes?
Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj. This question is from yesterday. You were explaining about government not able to implement the alcoholic rules and regulations prohibition. So sometimes we try to teach kids to not to have something which is sense gratification things, but still they want to do it as a parent. Still we have to help, we have to give them what they want. So I was seeing that the way it is explained that there will be sins cultivated for that, for the as a parent, for giving those things. So is that something I should understand in that way, Prabhu Maharaj?
Yes. The distinction between parenting and government in this particular example of government is parenting has a primary duty, and that's awaken the dormant spiritual consciousness of the dependent. So even in such a case, when sanctioning something that's not directly going to foster Krishna consciousness or remembrance of Krishna, that's what's behind the sanctioning. So the spirit of awakening one's dormant Krishna consciousness is good parenting, even when there's sanctioning of something that's not directly favorable for bhakti. And that's not the case with the government. This particular example of prohibition. Anything online? Okay.
From Sucharita Mataji. I was wondering why Lord Vishnu appears not Krishna when Krishna is the Supreme Lord.
Because Prithu has Aishvarya Bhav, so the Lord reciprocates according to the mood of the devotee. Next. That's it. Srila Prabhupada ki.